That was abundantly clear. We were attempting. So we were putting our resources on trying to find Gabby. We knew we would deal with Brian eventually, but this is certainly a twist.
Is there any concern, especially since the parents withheld this information, that this could be just another decoy, maybe a way to throw you off for a little bit while he moves on?
Well, I'll leave that speculation to you guys. Don't forget, I don't know. I've never had a missing child in my life, but I think you get to, a point of concern, whether that be a day, 2 days, 3 days. I think that depends on the individual and the circumstances. Remember, Gabby's parents, it was a significant amount of time before they became concerned. I can't.
Oh, welcome to Stillspeakpod. I'm going to do my very best to make this a lot quicker than I did last night. I just had a lot to say last night, and I needed to really get into the context of that first week of the case in order to discuss the whole mistaken identity thing, where Northport PD is now claiming they thought Brian came home on Wednesday the 15th in the Mustang, when really it was Roberta. And yes, that video from last night was an hour and a half, but please go take a listen to it because it says a lot about Northport. In my opinion, this was a misstep in a series of other missteps that they have taken. Now, let me take you back to Friday night, and I discussed this last night. I'm saying it again for a reason. So Friday night, Brian Ensign disclosed that Northport police did have surveillance cameras installed in neighbors' yards, and also one in a dumpster. They were installed before Brian took off and after Brian took off. And tonight, this evening, another reporter with WFLA actually disclosed that she too knew about these cameras, and that she actually had spoken to a different neighbor who had a camera installed on her property, and that one was installed on the 11th. As a reminder, the 11th is when Gabby Petito was reported missing by her mother. By that evening is when police went by the home, saw the van, and were handed a number to a lawyer who we now know as Stephen Bertolino. And so immediately that night after seeing the van there, cops apparently installed cameras. So this was 2 days before Brian allegedly left. Which this just further proves what I was saying last night, which was that Josh Taylor, who kept saying, that's the spokesperson for Northport PD, when he kept saying we can't do surveillance on residents, he hasn't committed a crime, bop, 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 bop. That was all a bunch of nonsense. And I knew that was a bunch of nonsense because I follow other cases, and I've seen in other cases when a person of interest is being tracked or has surveillance on them. So when he kept saying that, I'm thinking, that's not true. And we know they were watching him. So, yeah. And I said last night, recall that 3 different times, Josh Taylor also said that they saw Brian on first contact at the home. They just didn't speak to him, only for them to later then say, oh no, we didn't see him. So that was another mess up on Northport's, behalf. And as I was watching WFLA's live stream, somebody's comment got highlighted. I'm not really sure why, but she said, well, if the parents really did go out to the reserve on the 14th, the Tuesday, the day after he took off, to look for Brian, why did no reporters or anything see them leaving and coming home? Now, I'm not sure why her comment was highlighted, like I said, but there is, documentation that day, and I'm going to put it in the video, where they were not home, and then they do return home. So this was most likely when they had went to the reserve to search for Brian. At one point today, Josh Taylor made a statement to WFLA in which he said, quote, "This misidentification did not have a big impact on cost and the investigation. Other than confusion, it likely changed nothing. There is a good possibility that Brian was already deceased. He still needed to be found. We just wanted people to better understand why we thought we knew Brian was in his home. It was a direct result of a lack of cooperation from the family early on in this investigation," unquote. The first part of this statement I don't disagree with, and I said it last night, which is kind of funny. I said that really, in reality, even, if they had been watching him and they saw him go to the reserve, that at that point, if anybody had approached Brian to basically stop him, then Brian would have known that he was being tracked, and he would have found another way to end his life if he in fact did end his own life. We still don't know that. And so even with them having this quote-unquote mistaken identity, which I still think, give me a break, and every time I think about it, my eyes roll into the back of my freaking brain, it doesn't really change anything, right? Because he was already deceased. So I agree with that. That being said, I don't agree with the ending part, so let me repeat it so you know. The ending says that it was a direct result of a lack of cooperation from the family early on in the investigation. It's okay to admit when you make a mistake without trying to deflect that mistake. Just own it instead of saying, "Oh, well, yeah, but because of them." No, that's not how it works. Brian Laundrie and Brian's parents are not the first people to not immediately want to speak with police. And they're not the first to take their Fifth Amendment. And they're not the first who, refused to come in for questioning and got a lawyer. It happens all the freaking time. This mistaken identity thing has nothing to do with them not cooperating, but I see what he was trying to do. Whoops, I hit my mic. Sorry about that. He was trying to basically say, if you would have just cooperated from the beginning, we wouldn't have even needed to be watching Brian, right? So he's trying to deflect this onto the family, it's your fault that we thought Roberta was Brian. Nah, bro. Own it. Just admit that you messed up, that you had a mistaken identity. How? I don't freaking know, but just admit it. So WFLA reaches out to Stevie B. That's what I call him. His name is Stephen Bertolino. And he comes back with, quote, "I concur with Mr. Taylor that Brian may have already been deceased when NPPD realized that they, quote unquote, lost track of him. However, you can't blame the family because the police didn't know enough to follow someone they were obviously surveilling. This is a tragedy for two families, and any mistakes made by anyone or any entity involved should be acknowledged and used to train or educate others so the mistakes are not repeated." Unquote. And I agree with Stephen Bertolino. Now, have I agreed with a lot of things that Stephen Bertolino has said and done throughout all of this? No. Have I given him a hard time at certain points? Yes. This particular statement, I agree with him. And what's key here is he's saying what I just said. You can't blame the family because the police didn't know enough to follow someone they were obviously surveilling. That's on you, okay? And you see a lot of this deflection from Northport spokesperson. You do. Yesterday he did it too. When he was talking about this mistaken identity, he then, turned it and deflected to, well, they took the Mustang home from the reserve. I mean, who would do that? So he's constantly trying to redirect it back to the family. Even when Brian Ensign interviewed Josh Taylor about, a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, when asked how Brian can get away, which we now know at that time Brian Ensign was aware of these cameras, Josh Taylor turns to him and says, well, why didn't you see him leave? So it's all deflection. I'd have more respect here if they were just like, listen, I know this sounds freaking crazy, but we thought that Roberta was Brian, and we sort of messed up, but, every investigation, something happens, and unfortunately, that's what happened here. And you know what? We're sorry about that. And you know what? He wouldn't even need to apologize to the public, because who are we to be owed an apology? But I do think that there should be some form of apology for Gabby's family, right? That first week was insane. And this whole mistaken identity, are you serious? They were looking to you to help find their daughter, yet you couldn't even keep track of Brian Laundrie, and you couldn't even tell the difference between him and his mother? So, wow, not much confidence in Northport PD. And then let's talk about something else that happened today, and then I'm going to get to what I wanted to really talk about and hopefully end this quickly. So, the medical examiner's office was receiving a lot of emails and whatnot from reporters, because one news station, who I believe was Nancy Grace, actually ran with a title on her show saying that the DNA did not match the skull at the Carlton Reserve. This apparently turned out to be fake news. So the medical examiner decided to release a statement. That way they can kind of address everybody at once instead of replying to all these emails and calls and whatnot. Quote, the identity of the remains found at the Carlton Reserve on October 20th was confirmed by comparison to known dental records of Brian Laundrie. No DNA analysis has yet been performed on their remains. Samples will be submitted for DNA testing once the examination of the remains by the medical examiner's office is complete, unquote. For some reason, people just are like hanging on to any hope that the story really isn't over. As far as like Brian's dead, that's it. They just seem to really be wanting to hang on to this idea that these bones are going to magically now just poof, not be Brian Laundrie, even though they identified him already by dental records. Which implies they most likely found the bottom part of the jaw and, would have the, teeth there. So they think that, the DNA is not done, so there's still this chance it's not Brian Laundrie, and this has all been a big fake. No. The FBI is not going to come out and tell us that this is Brian Laundrie based on dental records if they're not 100% sure that it's Brian Laundrie. And just so you know, when an anthropologist drills into a bone to extract DNA, it could possibly, damage the bone. So they're most likely waiting for the anthropologist to actually, do his thing before extracting the DNA. So this makes total sense. And the DNA would just be a part of, the process or the protocol for how they're going to come to the conclusion of, everything as a whole. And there was some confusion because I guess at one point it was said that he's already on the way to the anthropologist, when really now it sounds like he's still with the medical examiner, or the bones are. I shouldn't say he is, but the bones are. And so people are annoyed by this as well, because they were thought we'd be getting answers right away. I wouldn't hold your breath, okay? I have a feeling we're going to be waiting quite a while to get any type of answers. Even when he gets to the anthropologist, it's going to be a while. Just my opinion. Okay, so now let's get to what I wanted to discuss. And I know I'm going back to this again, even after yakking about it last night for an hour and a half, but it's bothering me. I need you to understand something about me. I'm detail lady, okay? I need to see it. I need to know. I need to hear it. I need to hear it 1,000 times. And I need to be sure in my brain of these events so that I could process it and put it all together, okay? And sometimes I get obsessive about something because I'm just like, all right, I need to figure this out because this is bothering me. And this whole mistaken identity and Northport and that whole first week is really on my freaking nerves right now. It just is. And more so since Stephen Bertolino said at the end of last week that he did tell the FBI on Monday night, the 13th, that Brian went to the reserve and did not come home. Because that's an entirely different version of events from what Northport is claiming. And then we find out about these hidden cameras and their whole mistaken identity. And so everything as a whole is really bugging me. And I broke this down now twice in other videos. But now I'm going to put pictures and whatnot in this video to kind of, so we can see it in order. All right, you ready? So Saturday night, the 11th, when everybody else was feeling down and remembering September 11th and the tragedy that happened that day, another tragedy was about to be found out because Nicole Schmidt went to her local PD after attempting to do so the day prior, to report her daughter, Gabby Petito, missing. At that point, that county contacted Northport. Northport is the one who went past the home. They go to the house. They see the van. Now we know they did not see Brian, despite saying that they did, and that they just couldn't speak to him, so they did not see him, and they did not speak to him. And they were handed a note with Stephen Bertolino's phone number on it. And we know the day prior to that the family was blowing up their phones, trying to find Gabby. Nobody was responding, and at some point Joe Petito actually even said that they were contacting the police. Okay, and now we know from a reporter on WFLA, according to one of the neighbors she spoke to, they installed a camera that night, like almost immediately after going to the home, getting the lawyer's number, and, seeing the van there. On the 12th, next to nobody knew about Gabby Petito. And I actually thought that my first video was on the 14th when everybody started reporting on the case. But I went back, and it was actually the 13th that I did my very first video. Now, I know that I did see her poster in a group that's solely for missing people, and a lot of posters from the Aware Foundation are often posted there, and that's where I saw it. And I know that they put the information out really fast. So that's probably why I ended up, starting to talk about it and report on it prior to most of when the media did, because I seen that poster and I knew immediately that this story was going to be pretty big. So really, I started talking about this case the day Brian took off, which of course at that time, I didn't know he took off. Nobody knew that as far as the public was concerned. So 11th, cameras go up after the van's there. The 12th, her van is towed from the laundry home. On the 13th, Brian takes off. This is when I started reporting on the story. According to Stephen Bertolino, he called his FBI contact Monday evening and told them that Brian went to the reserve and did not come home. A couple of videos ago, I did a whole thing where I dug down into every single news article ever written on this case, and I was able to locate several pictures, which you will see on the screen, and I've shared them before, where it says Monday, and it's the father, and he's like doing yard work, he's sweeping, and then there's a picture of a police officer leaving a note at the laundry home. That was Monday the 13th. Now we know about this camera that was there on the 11th, so that means 2 days of them watching this home with the one camera. And then another camera, this day is the day that, according to Brian Enton, prior to Brian leaving, this day is when they installed another camera. And Stephen Bertolino says this is the day that he talked to Brian. He also spoke to him on the 12th, but this was the last time he spoke to him, was on the 13th, I guess prior to him taking off. On the 14th, the parents leave the home. This is documented because at this point now reporters were outside the home. They were gone for a period of time, and according to Stephen Bertolino, it was on the 14th that they went to the reserve to look for Brian and did not find him. And it's documented that they came home. There's a picture, I'll put it on the screen, where you see them coming back home after being gone for a period of time on the 14th. We also know on the 14th, midday-ish, that a abandoned car report was written about the Mustang at the environmental park. And the Mustang was not in the driveway on the 13th, and it was not in the driveway on the 14th. Allegedly, on the 15th, the parents went back to the environmental park parking lot area. They did look for Brian. At some point, they stopped and they saw a note on the Mustang saying that it would basically be towed. So they took the Mustang home. What does this mean? This means that they both left the home together in the pickup truck. And when they returned, Roberta, we now know, was driving the Mustang, and Christopher Laundrie was driving the pickup. So I got curious, and I'm like, all right, I'm going to find a damn picture of Roberta coming back that specific day in the Mustang on the 15th, because I needed to see it. It was just bothering me. Well, after many, many, many hours of attempting to locate some form of picture of her driving that Mustang that day, I came up with nothing. So, if somebody out there finds it, has it saved, I went through all of my bookmarks and saved and screenshots and Googled this and Googled that and did all different word combinations. I couldn't find it to save my life. Drives me nuts. So if you have it, please give it to me in the comments. So I couldn't find it. There is a picture of her driving the Mustang, but that was after the Mustang was towed after the search warrant, and then she brought it back home. That's not the time that there was the mistaken identity. So I would love to see that if it exists out there. But what I did find after scrolling through 16,000 posts of Brian Enton's is, and don't worry, I'm going to put this on the screen. And Brian Enton on September 15th has a tweet that is a picture of the home. The Mustang is in the driveway now, and so is the pickup. And it says, back outside Brian Laundrie's home. Not much has changed, but a lot more media. I pressed the police today on whether they know where he is located right now, and they said, quote, we have had an idea of where he has been, but it's not minute to minute, unquote, they say. That was his tweet. which is crazy fascinating because it says we have an idea of where he has been. But then they throw in, but it's not minute to minute. But Brian Enton has another tweet later on. September 15th, this is now evening, and it looks to be like a small video of outside the home. The house is all lit up from, it looks like those solar lights. It says, quote, pretty quiet out here tonight outside Brian Laundrie's home. Saw the parents earlier, but no sign of him. And then he says, I'll be live, blah, blah, blah. So this right here confirms that someone did see the parents outside the home on the 15th, but they didn't see Brian. Now, I don't know if Brian has gone through every picture he's ever taken, every footage he's ever taken with his cameraman or what. I would love for him to do that when he finds the time, because I would love to know if they have footage of actually Roberta getting out of that Mustang on the 15th, because right here he's saying he did see them earlier in that day on the 15th, but they did not see Brian. The next day, on the 16th, Brian Enton's tweet says, now this is also at night, quote, very quiet tonight outside Brian Laundrie's home. We are starting to think Brian and his parents left. Unlike yesterday, zero activity today and no lights on tonight. Police said again tonight they know where he is, but won't elaborate, unquote. Clearly the parents didn't leave, right? Because in the picture he's posting, it's got the pickup truck and the Mustang. So it's kind of funny, a little ironic here that he says that we're starting to think that Brian and his parents left. This was the day prior to us even knowing Brian wasn't in the home. So it seems the house was very, very quiet that night of the 16th. Well, let's go back to the 15th real quickly, okay? So now I just told you about the two tweets from Brian Enton. One is during the day on the 15th, where he says that a lot more media had shown up and that he talked to the police that day, the 15th, and they said that we have an idea of where he has been, but it's not minute to minute. And then the second tweet was at night, where he does mention seeing the parents earlier in the day. He didn't see Brian. Now, here's the fascinating part. So on the 15th is when they released images of Gabby's van in it looks like a garage of sorts where they had been, obviously combing through it. And they made a post, basically saying that Brian had returned on Monday, the September 1st. They also had Josh Taylor come out and answer some questions that morning about 11:30, and they also named Brian a person of interest on that day. So why is that important? Well, if they had this quote-unquote mistaken identity of thinking Roberta was Brian, so in their minds he just came home in the Mustang, after they got that information, right, that he came home in this Mustang, is when they now are like, okay, he's a person of interest. So this is now going back to what I was saying last night. Again, go listen to that video if you missed it. But I was saying there that everything is pointing to the fact that Northport knew Brian left the home. And this particular thing, the fact that they named him a person of interest on the same day they had this mistaken identity, just shows they knew he wasn't in the home prior to that. And I can explain that more in just a few minutes. So now the 16th, we know from Brian Enton's tweet that it was a really quiet day, to the point that he even thought that Brian and his parents had left. The house was really dark and quiet. On the 17th is when everything, all hell broke loose. And I've said that a couple of times now. There had been protesters outside the home the 14th, 15th, and 16th. But the 17th, there was a lot of protesters. And everybody was chanting and screaming and hollering at Brian because they thought that Brian was in the home. And at this point in the day, nobody, or up to this point overall, nobody knew how this Mustang was going to be a big part of the story. It wasn't until the police arrived that evening around 6 o'clock to the Laundrie home when everything went chaotic. And we saw Northport police going into the vehicle, the Mustang, to apparently look for something. They weren't in it for very long, and then they went back in the house. At that point, this Mustang became a very big part of the story. And then we find out that Brian's not in the home, and that his parents said that he drove in the Mustang to the environmental park and did not come home on what was originally said was Tuesday, which would turned out to actually be Monday. And trust me, I know this can all sound very confusing as it's being laid out. It's been a very crazy up and down type of story. I don't know what to tell you. This is all off the top of my head too. And I had to jot down a couple of notes because I'm like, I got to make sure I get all this correct. But it's been a lot. Obviously, Brian Ensign's tweets are off the top of my head. I had to go looking for those. But the rest, I was just like, all right, let's really break this down here. So let me go over this quickly as a summary so that I don't lose you completely here. The 11th, reported missing. They go to the house. Van's there. Get lawyer's number. Shortly after that, that same day, that evening, they install the first camera in a neighbor's yard or on her property. Boom, they're now watching, okay? What are they watching? Of course that camera is pointing towards the house. The driveway is unmistakable, so, you have to be pointing at something. What would be the whole point of setting up a camera if it wasn't pointing at the front of the home so that you could see the coming and goings of the family? Okay. On the 12th, the van is taken. Okay. On the 13th, they install more cameras, one allegedly down the road in a somewhat dumpster, and Brian Ensign says that he believes that one was showing the entire road. Once you pull out of Brian's driveway, you can go left or right, regardless of which way you're going. If there's a camera set up to see him coming or going, then you would most likely see the back of the car or the front of the car as it's driving towards the camera. So at this point, multiple cameras are set up. And what was the goal of those cameras? Of course, the goal of the cameras was to watch to see if he was going to come or go, or try to take off, or whatever the case may be. There would be no other motive other than that to put those cameras up. So, fast forward to that evening, Stephen Bertolino is now saying that he called his FBI contact to let them know that Brian had went to the reserve and that he did not come home. He claims that the FBI the other day confirmed that he did do this. We've yet to see proof. Honestly, after everything I've seen about this entire week now and reviewed and whatnot, I believe Stephen. And here's why I think they didn't do anything. This is what I think. The reason why they didn't do anything is because they already knew he left. And they already knew he didn't come home because they had the footage. So he's telling them, thinking like, hey, I'm telling them something and they're going to be really interested in this. And nothing came of it because they knew of it. They did not name Brian a person of interest on the 13th. They did not name Brian a person of interest on the 14th when his parents went to the reserve, and footage and photos back it up that they did leave for a period of time and then return to the home based upon what they were wearing. When you see them in the photos, it does appear like they're wearing sneakers and comfortable clothes like they had been, possibly looking in the reserve. The same day is when the abandoned car report was filed about the Mustang being at the environmental park. Again, this backs up that they knew where he either went or that he was not home, because as soon as they entered that report into the database with the tag number on it, they would have known that it was the Mustang belonging to the Laundrie family. Which brings us to the 15th. On the 15th, they release the pictures of the van in a garage after they had been combing through it for a few days, and they tweeted it. And on the 15th is the day that, just by chance, the Laundries leave the home in the pickup truck and they leave together. This also would have been caught on one of the cameras of them leaving together. And then upon returning, they were in two separate cars. Roberta was in the Mustang and Christopher was in the pickup truck. You would think that seeing them leaving together and coming back separately would not make them think that the one in the Mustang is Brian, that it would be Roberta. But now let's go to the 15th tweet from Brian Ensign, where they said, again, I'm going to repeat it, we have had, which is key, have had in an idea of where he has been, which, thanks to the surveillance camera and the abandoned car report and possibly Bertolino's phone call, they would have known where he had been. But at this point, they thought he came back, despite cameras showing them leaving together and coming back in two separate cars, which should have been enough to know that it wasn't Brian. Never mind the fact that Brian and his mother do not have the same body by any means. Give me a freaking break. Seriously, she has boobs and hips, and stop it. The 16th, the house was really quiet to the point that Brian Enton didn't even think they were in the home. And at this point, nobody knew what role that Mustang played except for the police. It wasn't until the next day on the 17th when things went chaotic, and that's when we found out about the Mustang. All this week, this particular week we're discussing, is when Josh Taylor kept saying, we don't do surveillance on residents, we can't track residents, citizens, blah, 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 which was all a bunch of BS because they had these cameras, right? So then he comes out on the 17th, and the night of the 17th, he calls into WFLA. He's super defensive because everybody was outraged. And then the next day begins the search in the Carlton Reserve. And he seems really, I don't know the word I want to describe him in this video. I guess I would say he seems like he's withholding something, which clearly they were withholding a lot at that point, but it felt like something specific, especially when questions about the parents were asked, because one of the biggest questions was, why did they wait till Friday to let, you guys know that he had taken off? And he's like, I don't know, and so he was sort of trying to paint this image of pointing the fingers at the parents. He also did it yesterday, like I said, and he did it today, where he's like, no more buts, okay? Just own it, please. Because even if you just completely own it, it still wouldn't have changed what happened. It just wouldn't have. Just own it and be over with it. Because really, in reality here, this caused a massive witch hunt against the parents. And it definitely looks suspicious. And even though I came on here and gave all these different plausible reasons on why they probably didn't report him, even at the end of the day, you can't get around the fact that it does seem suspicious. And you can't really blame people for considering that these parents had aided him in escaping because they spent days and didn't report him missing. But that appears to not be true. So how is that fair to the parents that this witch hunt was amplified by this thought that they didn't report their son missing for days and, aided him or whatever? And I know what you're going to say. And I know what some other people are going to say. Oh, who cares about them? They didn't answer Gabby's parents' phone call, and they didn't want to help search for her, and they got a lawyer. And I get what you're saying, but think of it this way. The 11th, okay, they weren't cooperating the 11th. Fine. A lot of people don't. That's what happens, right? In cases, some people just get worried and they don't want to be falsely accused of something, so they lawyer up. Okay. That's one thing. They don't help with the search. Well, the search for her hadn't even began yet. Okay? It didn't start for days later. And on Monday, he takes off. So that's only 2 days, technically, that they were being, quote-unquote, uncooperative. He takes off, and allegedly, they do tell the FBI through their lawyer that Brian did not come home. So you can be mad that they didn't answer the parents' phone call and initially weren't willing to help, but by Monday, only 2 days into the story out of, 6 weeks now, or almost 7 weeks now, that they were uncooperative. There was only 2 days out of X amount of days that they were uncooperative. So that goes to what Josh Taylor said today. At the end of his statement, he said, and I'm going to repeat it for you, quote, "It was a direct result of a lack of cooperation from the family early, keyword, on in this investigation." Yeah, Josh, 2 days in is really early in the investigation. You're right. You're absolutely right. But it's not their fault that you guys somehow thought that Roberta Laundrie was Brian Laundrie. So when they arrived on Friday night to the Laundrie home, and Josh Taylor says recently that night it was news to them that Brian had taken off. No, what was news to them was that they got it wrong and that it wasn't Brian, it was Roberta. They knew he left. They knew that. There's no doubt about it. They knew. They just thought he came home. You can only come home, remember that. You can only come home if you left at some point. They knew. And if I'm just going to go ahead and speculate here, what I think happened, because according to Stephen Bertolino, was that Friday they were contacted and told that there was a tip that Brian was in Tampa. And at that point it was said, well, we told you the other day that Brian took off. Now remember, Bertolino and the parents didn't know that they had these cameras. Now Bertolino's a lawyer, so he most likely knew that they were tracking them, but he probably didn't know about these cameras. And according to Stephen Bertolino, that's when they set up a time for the PD to go over to the house to talk to them about Brian being missing. And I think what's possible here is that after the Mustang returned home and they thought that it was Roberta, if they really thought that it was Roberta, which I still find very hard to believe, but that's their claim, so let's go with that, okay? That means that after the rest of the day on 15th, not seeing the Mustang leave, and then all day on the 16th, the Mustang didn't leave, and then most of the day on the 17th, the Mustang didn't leave, I think there's a possibility here that this supposed tip that Bertolino claims they said they had about a Brian Laundrie sighting in Tampa was a load of BS, and that was just a way for them to get in the home, or an attempt to get in the home to see if he was there, because at that point they thought he came home and that Mustang didn't leave again. And then when they were worried that maybe it wasn't Brian that came home on Wednesday and they needed a way to find out. So they just let's just say that there was a tip that Brian was in Tampa and maybe we could get in the home. Just my speculation there, or my theory on how that unfolded. I'm not sure I believe this whole Tampa sighting. The reason why I don't believe that is because at that point, prior to them going to the home on the 17th, nobody even knew that Brian wasn't in the home. So why would they have gotten a tip that Brian was in Tampa when most of all the public believed that he was in that home all week long? I mean, do you remember her father saying, my daughter's out in the wilderness and you're sitting in a recliner at home eating home-cooked meals? Nobody knew he wasn't in that home. So I think the Tampa tip thing, according to Stephen Bertolino, I think that was a lie by law enforcement to see if they could get some type of information out of the parents and get in the home and actually get their eyes on Brian. So at the end of the day here, hopefully that all made sense to you. I know it can seem really confusing, but when you break it down and boil it down and summarize it down and do all the downs, it still comes back to Northport PD knew Brian left. They thought he came home. End of story. So they can keep deflecting all they want, but they knew. It was not news to them on the 17th at all. So now if the parents were, only non-cooperative those first 2 days, and by Monday when Brian did not return home at that point, through their lawyer, they decided to, let police know their son left. How does that play into what has happened here between the Petito and Schmitz and the Laundries? Could this rift have been avoided? What if the Petito and Schmitz were told Monday night or Tuesday morning, hey, we saw Brian leave yesterday in the Mustang because we have video cameras set up. And last night, their lawyer called and he told us that Brian left, but we already knew that. But that's a sign that they're ready and willing to cooperate with us. Instead of making the parents think that these people were these freaking horrific, horrendous, heartless pieces of garbage who possibly helped their son escape the consequences of his actions. I mean, her family just recently was on TV saying that they did believe that he was possibly alive out there and he was just hiding. So this is messed up all around, not just to do that to the Laundrie parents and make the public believe that these parents withheld this information for days, but it's also wrong to the Petito Schmidt family because you had them thinking that these parents helped aid their parents' escape. I mean, her mom even said on 60 Minutes Australia, and this is getting longer than I wanted it to be, that she thinks that they have all the answers and she wants to know why they're doing this. Now, I can't blame the parents and I can't blame her mother. I'm just saying, and this all could have been avoided if Northport would have just said on Tuesday, listen, Brian left the home. We currently don't know where he is, but I just want to let you know that the lawyer called us last night and told us, even though we knew that already. And it would have just been, the story would have been so different. So my hope here is, and I know there'll be a big healing process involved in this, but I think this time will come at one point. My hope here is that these 6 grieving parents can allow things to die down. They each do their own, forms of grief. Gabby's, family has been grieving for over a month now. This is fresh and new to the Laundrie family. And I'm hoping that with Richard Stafford and Stephen Bertolino's help to be mediators, that there can be some type of conversation between these two families and they can discuss what actually happened and not what they were led to believe happened. And that they don't have to be the best of friends, but they can all come to the same conclusion that they all lost somebody they loved and a child at a very young age, and that this is an all-around tragedy. Possibly some apologies or explanations as to why they didn't answer the phone calls, and there can be some form of dialogue. Again, they don't have to then go on and now have like Christmas together and be the best of friends, but I'm hoping that the two families could, just come to an understanding of what the hell just happened here. And this just goes back to like the game of telephone or monkey in the middle, right? And who's in the middle? The law enforcement is. You got the FBI here, the FBI there. You got all these search and rescue crews, and then you have law enforcement and local law enforcement and state law enforcement. And so they were they were in the middle of these two families and these two stories going on that were both connected. And then in the game of telephone, it's like you say one thing, you say it to another person, and there's that miscommunication. I'm not really talking that it's like that, but it feels like kind of a mixture of monkey in the middle. I know you guys all remember that game, and like a twist of the game telephone. So honestly, I blame a lot of people here. I don't blame the Laundries. I'm sorry, but I don't. I think that there was a lot of freaking missteps and a lot of shit. Excuse my language. Crap. Sorry. It's too late now. Could have been avoided. And it's a shame. It's an absolute shame because everything was just fueled by the public's interest in this case. And a story of parents helping their child escape is much more fascinating and intriguing than it is to believe otherwise. And now that I went way longer than I wanted it to be 30 minutes, I would like to go to bed at a normal hour, so I am out of here now. Please check out the video that I'm going to put up with this one involving a missing man named Kian McLaughlin. He too is missing in Grand Teton National Park since June. I would greatly appreciate you sharing that video. And tomorrow I will be doing a Murdaugh story update video. And possibly not tomorrow, but maybe the next day, I will be doing my missing video where I do multiple missing people in one video. So I also would appreciate you sharing that. So I'm going to leave you to process all that. I should have warned you to get a notepad out and just kind of jot this down so that your brain can process all of it. Really what it boils down to is this. What the hell, Northport? Seriously, guys? Really? Like, I get that you don't deal with cases this high profile on a daily basis, and this is probably one of the biggest cases you've ever handled and probably ever will handle. But even still, come on, man. Just stop deflecting. Just admit it. It's okay. It's okay to be wrong. It's okay if you make a mistake. Owning it is the important part, and then trying to correct it is the next part. And by correcting it, it's being a part of the dialogue that hopefully will come between the two families. And it's the right thing to do. But you're law enforcement, you most likely won't do that because everything's like by the book and protocol and procedures and yada, yada, yada. And the next main point and my finale to this video, and I said it earlier and I'm saying it again so it could, process in your brain. They thought he came home. They thought he came home. That proves they knew he left. And until next time, I'll see you soon.
We're looking for somebody. That's it. I mean, we can't go just pulling people in. He certainly has the Fifth Amendment not to speak. And, we're respectful of that. We get it. We're frustrated. Just a couple more, please. I'm sure I could be here all day.